All right, you guys, today we're going to do a quick set of notes on what's known as the English Reformation. This is going to go along and build on kind of what you guys went over yesterday with the Protestant Reformation. This movement that kind of Martin Luther inadvertently begins, that sort of sparks this whole upheaval across Western Europe as these new ideas come about that start to challenge the Catholic Church and the power of the Catholic Church, which has essentially bound so many people of Europe together for so many centuries during the Middle Ages. And what ends up happening is that this Protestant Reformation across Europe sparks all these religious wars that break out between Protestants and Catholics and the Pope and the people who claim to be leaders of these new Christian religions. In England, what happens in England is going to be one of the most dramatic of all of these stories. And today's story is the story of the famous, or you could say infamous, famous for not being good, English king by the name of King Henry VIII. Very notorious king in England's history, due to mainly because of the story we're talking about here right now. So, our story kind of begins with this, this king, King Henry VIII, and he's the king who's been king of England. His family's been in a long line of succession as far as ruling over the English kingdoms for many, many years when he becomes king. And so we're kind of going to talk about that. And it's this whole tale of family drama and court intrigue where you got these people sort of, going behind each other's backs and all these different things being pulled, strings being pulled by various people to kind of shape what happens in England. But the whole thing, it's important to remember, this is all going on in the context or during the period of this religious upheaval across Europe with the Protestant Reformation going on. So the story of the English Reformation, what happens in England, is going to begin again with King Henry VIII. Now, this guy became king of England when he was fairly young. He was in his, late teens when he takes over as king. And he's a great king. The people of England love him. He's handsome. He's well-spoken. He's a good leader. And, he's also very devoted. He's a very devout Catholic, very much aligned with the Pope. In fact, the Pope considers him one of the closest allies because King Henry VIII was a diehard Catholic, a huge defender of the Catholic faith in England. And especially as this upheaval is going on in the German states with Martin Luther and then in places with John Calvin and all these other Protestant Reformation movements, King Henry VIII says, I am a defender of Catholicism. The problem for King Henry VIII is he was married at the time to his first of what is going to be several queens of England under his rule. Okay, so his first marriage is to a woman by the name of Catherine of Aragon. Okay, and this is where our story is going to begin. So King Henry VIII decides he needs a divorce, an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And the reasoning and the basis for this is because King Henry VIII has been trying to create a successor to the throne, meaning he needs to have a child, a boy, to succeed him as the future king of England. And him and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, have had a child, but it's a girl known as Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is going to be the only child that they're able to conceive. And now we got to step back and remember, this is 500 years ago. This is in the early 1500s. And at this time, we didn't understand the biology behind how children were born. We didn't understand chromosomes. Two X's make a boy, and the X and the Y chromosome mix to make a girl, so on and so forth. That it's sheerly based on DNA and chromosomes. Okay? Men believed at the time, and women to an extent as well, that it was the woman's responsibility to give birth to a boy, particularly these kings and queens. So Henry VIII is super upset with his wife. And he goes to the Pope. He says, Pope, I need a divorce, what's called an annulment. I need you to make my marriage no longer valid. Now remember, at this time, the Catholic Church said part of the important sacraments of being a Catholic to get to heaven was that you had to be married inside the Catholic Church and be blessed in a Catholic ceremony. So the Pope says, no way, Henry, I can't give you a divorce because number one, it goes against the Catholic teachings, and secondly, and probably even more importantly, Henry VIII had already made, the Pope had already made a special exception for Henry VIII. In fact, Henry VIII became king when his brother died. And he became king of England, and his first wife, Catherine, was actually his dead brother's wife. And he wanted to marry her. So the Pope made an exception for King Henry VIII and said, all right, I'll let you marry your dead brother's wife. And now here's Henry down the road saying, hey, I need a divorce from that lady because she can't give me a son. The only child they have is a daughter. I'm sorry, the daughter is Mary Tudor is her name. Okay, Mary, she's going to be known as Queen Mary eventually. Well, meanwhile, while this is going on, the Pope is refusing to grant Henry VIII his annulment. And at the same time, he's fallen in love with another woman. There's this girl named Anne Boleyn. She works in service to his wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, and Henry VIII falls in love with her. And he says, I need to marry her. I need a divorce from my wife, Catherine. I want to marry this lady that I'm in love with, this young girl. And by this time, King Henry VIII is like this fat old guy. He's gluttonous. He overeats. He's way overweight. And he's kind of like that typical, fat king you think of when you think of a king. And he's in love with this young, probably, we guess, 16, 17-year-old, 18-year-old girl. And he wants to marry her. The Pope says no. So the Pope refuses to give him an annulment. And this is where the story is going to begin to get a little chaotic. So we got Henry VIII, who's married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He believes it's her fault that he does not have a son. The only child he has is his daughter named Mary. So he wants to divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refuses to grant him his annulment. So what Henry VIII does is says, you know what? Forget it. I'm the King of England. I'm just going to simply break free from the Roman Catholic Church. I'm going to say, you know what? I'm no longer Catholic, and England is no longer Catholic. I'm going to create my whole new church. He calls it the Church of England. It's known as the Anglican Church at this point. And what he's going to do is he's going to say, look at this now. I've created a whole new Christian church, known as the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And guess who's in charge of it? Me. And guess what I'm going to give myself? A divorce. So he gets his annulment. And he says, look at me, I'm free, and I'm going to marry this young Anne Boleyn, and we're going to have a baby boy that's going to be the next King of England, and everything's going to be great. Except they have a child, and it's a daughter, and her name is Elizabeth. She's going to be a huge factor in the history of England coming up here. Okay, so he's divorces his first wife, marries the girl that he's in love with, Anne Boleyn. They have a child that's a daughter, and he is upset. He is mad. He blames Anne Boleyn for not giving him the son to succeed him. Because we have to remember, when it comes to the line of succession in the monarchy, it's always the eldest son that succeeds the king, and then the second eldest and third, and if there's no son, then it goes to the oldest daughter, and all the way through the list of daughters, until if there's nobody there, it goes to the next, like a brother of a king, or a cousin, but he needs a son. So essentially what happens is Anne Boleyn is going to be brought up on charges by the king that she is adulterous, that she's cheating on him. And he's going to use that as his justification for essentially having her head chopped off. So he has her beheaded. Basically for not having a son is the reason why. So now he's divorced his first wife, he's beheaded his second wife, and he says, look at me, I'm free again. So he's going to marry a third wife. His third wife's going to be known as Jane Seymour. Okay, and the reason he's able to do all this stuff is because as all this is going on, the Parliament of England, sort of the governing body that the king sort of works with, has passed a new law called the Acts of Supremacy. And it says the English ruler, the head of England, the king or queen, is the head of not just England's politics, but they're also the head of this church, the Anglican or English church. And it's this kind of blend of Catholic traditions with some Protestant elements thrown in, or new elements that the king says, this is how we're going to do it here. Like, for example, there's going to be what's called the King James Bible, the English Bible, which is going to be written in English as opposed to being in Latin like the Catholic Church says. So in the meantime, Henry VIII says, okay, wife number 3, this is going to be the one that rescues me. So he marries Jane Seymour, and they have a child, and this time it's a baby boy. Little King Edward. He's finally got his son. He's so happy Jane Seymour did it. This is the love of his life for doing it. The problem for Jane Seymour is, while giving birth to little baby Edward, she dies. And so now wife number 3 is dead. Divorce number 1, beheaded number 2, number 3 dies, giving birth to the only son. So at this point, King Henry VIII has 3 children. His first daughter, Mary Tudor, his second daughter, Elizabeth, and his third is his son, little Edward. Now, eventually, what's going to go on is that Edward is going to succeed his father as the King of England down the road. But that's not going to be until we get a little further along in our story, because what ends up taking place is Henry VIII ends up marrying 3 more times. So after he ends up marrying after his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, dies giving birth to little Edward, he's going to marry his 4th wife. Okay? And this time he tries to marry a woman her name's going to be Anne of Cleves, wife number 4. Yep. And essentially what ends up happening with her is he basically says, all right, you're going to be the one that I'm going to marry, I'm going to love you. And he basically brings her in, and he brings her in. She comes from Germany. And his advisor says, we got to create an alliance with Germany. So he sees a picture of her, and they bring her to the court in England. And he says, oh, this lady looks nothing like her portrait did. He doesn't think she's attractive. So he ends up divorcing her as well. So now he's divorced his 4th wife. Then he falls in love with his fifth wife. Catherine Howard is her name. She's young, she's beautiful, he's in love with her, but she's a little wild, and she's known for partying around the castle and the palace, and kind of, causing problems with, other men. He thinks she's cheating around behind his back. So guess what happens to her? Just like Anne Boleyn, whoosh, off with the head. So his 5th wife gets beheaded. Then his 6th and final wife, who he finally marries, Catherine Parr is her name, she's actually going to outlive him. So eventually King Henry VIII is going to die after 6 wives. His 1st wife divorces her, 2nd wife beheads, 3rd wife dies giving birth to his child, 4th wife divorces her, 5th wife has her head chopped off, and 6th wife outlives him. But ultimately, when he ends up dying, the throne gets passed to his eldest son, who's his only son, King Edward VI, or Edward. He's only a 9-year-old kid when he becomes King of England. And like any 9-year-old kid, he can't run a country. So what ends up taking place is he's going to be pulled and basically led by his uncle Edward, Henry VIII's brother-in-law, from one of his marriages, one of those many marriages. And Uncle Edward here basically is opposed to the Catholic Church. So we're going to see under King Edward, the church shift more towards a Protestant to get rid of a lot of the elements of Catholicism, which is going to anger the Pope once again in Rome. However, Edward dies at a very young age. He dies when he's only like 15 years old. So the next in line to become the leader of England is his first sister, his half-sister, the first daughter of Henry VIII, Mary Tudor, the one from his 1st wife. Now Mary takes over. Now she was raised by her mother, who was a die-hard Catholic before his mother got divorced from King Henry VIII. And she says, England is not a Protestant nation. It is a Catholic country. So she takes the Anglican Church and moves it back to Catholicism. In fact, she is super opposed to the Protestants. She, in fact, starts rounding up Protestants all across England and has them beheaded and hung and imprisoned. In fact, Mary Tudor gets a nickname. They call her Bloody Mary for killing all the Protestants that she did in England. But Mary Tudor is not going to survive all that long either, and she's going to end up dying before she has any children. So there's no heir for her to become the next leader of England, which means the throne is going to pass to Henry VIII's 2nd child, his daughter, from his 2nd wife, Anne Boleyn, the one that he wanted to marry so badly when he got his first divorce, and that's going to be Elizabeth. And Elizabeth I is going to inherit the throne from Mary when she's 25 years old. She's going to have one of the longest reigns in England's history. She's going to rule for nearly 60 years. She's more of a Protestant, so she says, my half-sister Mary, Bloody Mary, was crazy. We're going back towards more of a Protestant. However, she's going to form a settlement that's basically a compromise between the Catholics and the Protestants in England, called the Elizabethan settlement, that's essentially set England on a path for unity and stability that's going to give them the wealth and the power that's going to let them establish the colonies in the Americas, and is going to give them an opportunity to explore the new lands in the Americas, and it's going to kind of set England on the path that they're on to create what become known as the 13 American colonies, which is going to lead to eventually, of course, the United States. So that's the story of the Elizabethan settlement and the English Reformation. So just to go over the many wives of Henry VIII one more time. Here's Henry VIII, his 1st wife. He's married to her. He divorces her for not getting his son. That's when he creates the new Church of England, or the Anglican Church. After his 1st wife, he gets his divorce. When he creates his own church and gives himself the divorce, he marries his 2nd wife, Anne Boleyn. When she has a daughter named Elizabeth, he says, you can't have a son either, apparently, so his head chopped off. He falls in love with Jane Seymour. She gives birth to the only son, Edward. He thinks she's great. Problem is she dies giving birth to the boy. He marries the 4th wife, and he finds her not attractive based on what he thought she was supposed to look like, so he divorces her. He marries his 5th wife. She's a little promiscuous around the palace, so he has her beheaded, and he finally marries his sixth wife, who outlives him. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wives of Henry VIII. And ironically enough, Henry VIII dies of a disease called syphilis, which is an STI, a sexually transmitted infection that he ends up getting, and that's what ultimately causes his death. So that's the story of the Tudor family. That's their name, the Tudors. You got Henry VIII is kind of the patriarch of it. His first wife, Catherine. They have one child who's Mary Tudor. His second wife is Anne Boleyn. She gets beheaded after giving birth to Elizabeth I. His only son is with his third wife, who's Edward, and a Protestant. Elizabeth is more of a Protestant herself, and that's going to be leading to the Elizabethan settlement. So that's the story of the Tudor family, or Henry VIII, and the English Reformation. That's how England becomes a reformed country with this new Church of England, constantly shifting between Catholic and Protestant and back and forth, but ultimately it's going to remain a Protestant nation as the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, remains in power. All right, that's the end of the notes for today.